A true story about this grandma. The secret she kept that changed everything. You won't believe it. Have you ever faced a moment in life that felt like everything was falling apart? A time when you didn't know how you'd keep going, yet somehow found the strength you didn't know you had? This is the story of someone who faced that very moment. Someone who walked through hardship and came out stronger on the other side. Let's take a quiet moment to reflect on the journey that led them to a life-changing revelation. A sudden change. Evelyn sat in the quiet living room, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound that filled the empty space. The house was still, almost unnaturally so, after the chaos that had ensued in the weeks following Richard's passing. It had been a month, yet it felt like only yesterday she had woken up beside him, his deep voice murmuring, "Good morning," as the sun streamed through the window. Now, that morning ritual was gone, leaving a gaping hole in her heart that she wasn't sure how to fill. Richard had been her rock for over 35 years. They'd built a life together, full of love, laughter, and dreams they'd shared from the moment they met. His sudden death had taken her by surprise, the kind of shock that leaves a person numb, unable to grasp the full reality of the situation. Heart disease wasn't something Richard had spoken much about, and while his doctors had warned him to take it easy, there had been no warning, no sense of imminent danger. He'd collapsed on a Tuesday morning, and just like that, her world had come crashing down. She had been in the kitchen when it happened. The smell of fresh coffee was still in the air when she'd heard his heavy footsteps falter, followed by the sickening sound of him hitting the floor. By the time the ambulance had arrived, it was already too late. Evelyn had felt a deep, gut-wrenching emptiness that no amount of comforting words from friends and family could fix. In the days that followed, the house was filled with visitors, well-meaning neighbors, distant relatives, and friends who all shared their condolences. They spoke of Richard as if he was still around, telling stories of his warmth and humor, his hard work, and the love he had for his family. But Evelyn didn't want to hear it. The flood of memories only made the ache in her chest worse. She wasn't ready to let go, not yet. Her son, Andrew, had been particularly concerned. He came by every day, checking on her, making sure she ate, making sure she was okay. But the truth was, she wasn't okay. She didn't know how to be okay. Richard had been the center of her universe, and without him she felt lost. Andrew, who had been living in another state with his wife and children, had promised to stay in town for a while, and she appreciated that. But even his presence didn't fully ease the pain. Andrew was good-hearted, but he was also a bit impatient, always trying to fix things. He didn't understand that grief couldn't be fixed by a well-meaning gesture or a few reassuring words. Sometimes, grief just had to be lived with. But there was more than just grief weighing heavily on Evelyn's mind. In the days after the funeral, as the guests trickled away and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, Evelyn found herself alone with her thoughts and her memories. It was in those quiet moments that the enormity of what had happened really started to sink in. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in her life. She had spent her days caring for Richard, managing the household, and raising Andrew. Now, she felt like a woman suddenly set adrift, with no anchor to hold her in place. The future seemed uncertain, and the fear of what lay ahead gripped her like a vice. Evelyn had never been particularly savvy when it came to finances. She'd trusted Richard to handle that part of their life, knowing that he had a steady job as a mechanic and had always been prudent with money. They'd lived a comfortable life, nothing extravagant, but certainly enough to enjoy the little pleasures that came with a steady income. She hadn't worried about bills, savings, or investments. Richard had taken care of it all. But now, she was faced with the reality that Richard's death had left her in charge of everything. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. There were the bills, of course, the utilities, the insurance, the mortgage. But it wasn't just that. Evelyn had to figure out how to move forward without Richard's steady hand to guide her. She found herself suddenly overwhelmed by simple decisions, things she had never had to think about before. What should she do with the house? Should she stay here? Or should she sell and move closer to Andrew, who had suggested more than once that she come live with them? But it was more than that. Evelyn was haunted by the idea that Richard had left her with nothing more than memories. She knew he had worked hard, saving for their future. But was that all he had left her? Had he prepared her for this day when he wouldn't be around to help her through the hard decisions? It was on one of those sleepless nights that Evelyn first began to wonder if she had been left in the dark. Richard had always been a man of few words when it came to his finances. He never discussed savings or investments in any detail, and whenever Evelyn asked about it, he would smile and assure her that everything was fine. But now, as she sat in the silence of their home, she began to question whether that was the full truth. She had never asked Richard about his investments, his savings, or his plans for their future. It had never seemed necessary, but now that he was gone, she couldn't help but wonder if he had been keeping secrets that might offer her some security and peace of mind as she navigated this new chapter of her life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn resolved to take control of her future, starting with the things Richard had left behind. Little did she know that in the coming days, she would uncover more than just memories of her husband. She would discover a hidden legacy that would change everything. Andrew's decision. The morning after the funeral was eerily quiet. Evelyn had woken up early, as she always did, but now there was no soft murmur of Richard's voice to greet her. She stood in the kitchen, preparing a cup of coffee for herself, though it didn't taste the same as it used to. Richard's favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle, still sat on the counter, untouched. She ran her fingers over it for a moment, as if trying to capture the essence of his presence in the simple act of remembering. Andrew had been on the phone for most of the morning, pacing back and forth in the living room. He was discussing something with his wife, Carla, and occasionally he'd pause, glancing at his mother. Evelyn, who had grown used to the sound of Andrew's voice around the house over the past few weeks, didn't interrupt. She was used to his overbearing nature, his tendency to make decisions without consulting anyone. It was something that had irritated Richard in the past, but Richard had always been more patient than Evelyn, more inclined to let things unfold. But this was different. This wasn't just any decision. This was about her, and Evelyn wasn't sure how to feel about it. Andrew came into the kitchen, his face drawn with concern. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his tone carrying an urgency she couldn't ignore. Evelyn set down her coffee, noticing his hands shaking slightly. She frowned, setting the cup aside. "What's going on, Andrew?" she asked, trying to read his expression. "I've been thinking about this a lot," he began, his voice tight. "And I know it's been hard for you. You don't need to worry about everything. You've been through enough already." Evelyn couldn't help but feel a little defensive. "What are you talking about, Andrew?" His expression softened slightly, though there was still an air of determination about him. "I think it's time for us to make some changes around here. You're not going to be able to manage this place on your own, Mom. It's too much. I've been talking to Carla, and we think it would be better for you to move in with us, in the city. You can live with us, and we'll take care of you." Evelyn blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" "I've been living here for over 30 years. This is my home, Andrew." "I know, but you can't keep this place running on your own. You need help and the house. It's just too big for you now. Plus, it's old." You've got the mortgage and all those bills. You're not thinking clearly, and it's only going to get worse." Evelyn's heart began to race, her emotions swirling inside her. How could he be suggesting this? Why was he so sure that she couldn't manage? "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "This is where Richard and I built our life together. This house holds everything, our memories, our family. It's not just a place, Andrew. It's everything." Andrew paused, running a hand through his hair. "I get that, Mom. I really do. But you have to think about your future. We're offering you a comfortable life, and you're not getting any younger. You need to think practically. We'll find a nice place in the city, a smaller house, and you can visit whenever you want. But you can't stay here. You don't have the means to keep this up on your own." Evelyn stared at him, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. It wasn't the suggestion to move that hurt. It was the way Andrew seemed to disregard her ability to make decisions for herself. It was as though he had already assumed that she couldn't handle it, as if she were incapable of thinking for herself. She had never been a frail, weak woman. She'd worked hard her entire life, helped Richard with everything, and had always been the rock for her family. And now, here was her son, making decisions about her future without even consulting her, as if he were the one in charge. "Why are you pushing me so hard?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady but filled with hurt. "I know you're trying to help, but this is my life, my home. I don't want to leave it, and I don't need you to take care of me. I can still manage." Andrew's face tightened. "Mom, I know it's hard to let go, but I'm doing this because I care about you. You're not thinking clearly, and I just want to make sure you're okay. I know you think you're fine, but you're not. You don't have the energy you used to. You're alone now, and we're here for you. Don't you think it's time to move on? You deserve better than this old house." Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling a wave of frustration and sadness wash over her. She had never thought of herself as old, but the way Andrew was talking made her feel like she had suddenly aged a decade. It was as though, by losing Richard, she had also lost her independence, her voice, her very identity. She turned away from him, feeling the sting of his words. The last thing she wanted was to be treated like a burden, but that was how she felt now, as if her worth was being measured by her ability to maintain the house, manage her finances, and be the perfect mother. Andrew seemed to think that taking care of her meant taking control of everything, dictating how her life should be. "Andrew, I need time to think about this," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to make any decisions right now. I need some time to figure this out." He looked at her, his brow furrowing in frustration, but he didn't push further. "Fine," he said, his voice tinged with impatience. "But you need to think about it. You can't stay here forever." Evelyn watched him leave the kitchen, feeling a weight settle in her chest. She wasn't sure what the right answer was. Part of her knew that Andrew was only trying to help, but another part of her resented his assumption that she couldn't handle it. This was her life, her home, and she wasn't ready to let go of either just yet. As she stood there, looking out the window at the familiar view of the garden Richard had tended for years, Evelyn realized something profound. She wasn't ready to give up the life she had built with Richard. Not yet. Not ever. And no matter what Andrew thought, she had every right to decide her own future. The unseen legacy. Evelyn couldn't help but feel the weight of Andrew's words as they echoed in her mind long after he had left for the day. The suggestion to move out of the house, to leave everything she had known for decades, lingered like a shadow. She didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not without understanding why it felt like her entire existence was being challenged. Richard had always taken care of things. He was the one who handled the finances, made the decisions, and ensured their future was secure. But now that he was gone, Evelyn realized she didn't know much about how he had done that. She didn't know much about the financial side of their life at all. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. She had always trusted Richard, trusted that he would make sure everything was in place for their retirement, for their future. But had she been too trusting? Had she left it all to him, assuming he'd always be there to hold things together? She had spent so many years focusing on the day-to-day, raising Andrew, managing the household, supporting Richard, that she hadn't paid attention to the details that mattered most in the long run. Evelyn had never been the type to question Richard's decisions. They had always operated as a team, balancing each other out. Richard was the planner, the provider, and she was the nurturer, the homemaker. It was a role she had gladly taken on, but now, with Richard gone, she was left to face the reality of their financial situation alone. It was during one of her late-night sleepless sessions, flipping through old papers in the study, that Evelyn stumbled across something unusual, a thick folder labeled with her name in Richard's neat handwriting. She hadn't noticed it before, tucked away behind a stack of receipts and financial documents. The folder was filled with papers she didn't recognize, and at first glance, they didn't make much sense to her. There were property titles, bank statements, and what appeared to be investment portfolios, some of them dating back to the early years of their marriage. Curious, she sat down at Richard's old desk, feeling the weight of the moment. She hadn't realized how little she truly knew about their financial dealings, but now, as she rifled through the papers, it became clear that Richard had been much more than just a mechanic. He had been a shrewd investor, a man who had quietly built a significant fortune through real estate. It was almost as if Richard had planned for the possibility that one day Evelyn would be left to navigate these things alone. He had left everything for her, everything but the understanding of what it all meant. As she sifted through the documents, Evelyn's heart began to race. Richard had invested in multiple properties, many of them commercial spaces that were now worth millions. There were pages and pages detailing the rental incomes, the investments he had made, and the real estate he had acquired over the years. Evelyn had no idea how vast their assets were. He had made it clear that he wanted to provide for her, but now she realized just how much he had thought ahead. Richard had anticipated that this day might come when Evelyn would need to stand on her own. He had put everything in her name, his business, his investments, everything. For the first time since Richard's passing, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't as alone as she had thought. She had a foundation, a financial legacy that Richard had built carefully and thoughtfully. She wasn't just some widow left with nothing but memories. She was a woman with real resources, a woman who could still stand strong, even in the face of all the changes that had come her way. But there was more. The documents revealed something else. Richard had also arranged for a trust to be set up for Andrew, one that would come into effect once he turned 40. At first, Evelyn thought it was just another of Richard's ways of providing for their son. But as she read further, she realized that Richard had anticipated Andrew's behavior, even down to the way he would handle his inheritance. He had set up specific conditions for Andrew's access to the funds, conditions that were designed to ensure that Andrew wouldn't squander everything Richard had worked for. Richard had known Andrew's personality well. He had known that Andrew's desire for material wealth could cloud his judgment. The trust stipulated that Andrew could not access any significant portion of the inheritance until he had demonstrated responsibility, maturity, and an understanding of the family's values. Evelyn's heart sank as she read these terms. It was clear that Richard had seen the same impulsiveness in Andrew that she had seen all his life, his tendency to rush into decisions, to focus on the surface without fully understanding the consequences. Evelyn couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She was proud of Richard for being so thoughtful, so careful about their family's future, but she also felt betrayed by the implications of what Richard had left behind. Had he believed, deep down, that Andrew wouldn't be capable of handling the family wealth? Or was it that he had simply wanted to protect Evelyn from the selfish tendencies he had seen in their son? Her thoughts were interrupted when she found one last document, an official will, dated just a few months before Richard's death. It was clear that Richard had been preparing for the worst, even though his death had been sudden. The will was straightforward, leaving everything to Evelyn. But it also included a personal note, handwritten in Richard's familiar script. "I've left you everything, Evelyn, because I trust you. But I've also left instructions for Andrew, should he need guidance. I know you'll do what's best, but please, remember to take care of yourself too. You've always put others first, but now it's time to think about your own future." Evelyn's eyes welled up as she read the words. Richard had known her so well, had understood her need to care for others, but also knew that it was time for her to focus on her own future. She had spent so much of her life in the background, supporting Richard, taking care of Andrew, that she had neglected her own needs, her own desires. But now, as she looked at the papers in front of her, she realized that Richard had given her the power to reclaim her life. This wasn't just about money. It was about the life Richard had built for her, a life that she could now take control of. The power was in her hands, and it was time for her to decide what to do with it. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart still heavy with grief, but now also filled with determination. She wasn't just a widow. She was a woman with a future to shape, with choices to make. And she was going to make them on her own terms. A shocking discovery. The next few days passed in a blur for Evelyn. There was so much to process, so much to untangle from the maze of Richard's life. Each time she thought she had taken a step forward, there seemed to be more questions waiting for her. The discovery of Richard's hidden financial legacy had shaken her to her core. What started as a simple search for papers to handle the bills and the mortgage had turned into something much bigger, a revelation that had completely shifted her perception of her life, her marriage, and even her son, Andrew. The papers Richard had left behind were detailed, complex, and for the first time, Evelyn felt like a stranger in her own life. Richard had been careful with his investments, meticulous about his business dealings, and though she had always trusted him to take care of things, she now realized that she hadn't understood half of what he had been doing all these years. He had built a small empire, and he had done it quietly, methodically, with a vision far beyond what Evelyn had ever imagined. As Evelyn sat in the study one afternoon, looking over the portfolio of properties Richard had accumulated, a sudden thought crossed her mind. Why had he never talked to her about it? Why had he kept all of this a secret from her? It wasn't that Evelyn didn't trust Richard. She did. But she had always relied on him to handle things in the background. He had assured her time and time again that everything would be fine, that they were set for the future. But now, she found herself wondering if his assurances had been more about his own desire to protect her from stress than about actually including her in his plans. The portfolio was impressive, a mixture of commercial and residential properties scattered throughout the city and even in neighboring states. Each piece of property was a small part of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle Richard had spent his entire life putting together. Some of the properties were valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars, others at millions. There were rental incomes, tax documents, and repair records, everything meticulously organized. But there was also something unexpected among the papers, an old weathered notebook that Richard had kept hidden in a drawer of his desk. It didn't look like anything important at first glance. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, and the handwriting inside was messy, almost rushed. Evelyn opened the notebook cautiously, unsure of what she would find inside. The first few pages were filled with notes about the properties, addresses, maintenance schedules, tenant information, and other mundane details. But as she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. There were references to things she had never heard of before. Business partners, private loans, secret deals Richard had made with other investors. It was a side of Richard she had never seen, a side that was deeply involved in the world of high-stakes investments, deals, and even some questionable legal practices. Her fingers trembled as she continued reading. Richard had made some risky decisions, ones that Evelyn wasn't sure she could approve of if she had known about them at the time. There were mentions of leveraged buyouts, private negotiations, and off-the-books transactions that seemed to benefit Richard, but could have easily backfired if things had gone wrong. It was a side of Richard that she hadn't expected, a man willing to take risks for the sake of their future, but at the same time, a man who had kept these secrets hidden away, believing he was protecting her from the stress of it all. But it wasn't just the risky investments that unsettled her. It was the larger picture that began to emerge as she pieced the notebook together with the other documents in the portfolio. Richard had been working with a group of investors, some of whom Evelyn didn't recognize, to acquire properties under the guise of smaller independent businesses. But as she read deeper into the records, it became clear that these businesses were not as independent as they appeared. They were interconnected, part of a larger web of investments that Richard had set up, most of which had been placed under Evelyn's name for legal and financial protection. As she read through the final pages of the notebook, Evelyn's heart dropped. There, at the very end, was a mention of a final settlement, a term she had never encountered before. Richard had been in the process of finalizing a large business transaction that, if completed, would have netted the family millions, enough to ensure Evelyn's security for the rest of her life. But the deal had been in the early stages when Richard passed away. Now, it seemed as though the deal had fallen through, leaving Evelyn with the remnants of a broken legacy. But there was more. There, hidden among the final pages of the notebook, Evelyn found something even more shocking. There were instructions, written in Richard's hand, that she had never expected to read. These instructions were not for her, but for Andrew. Richard had left a message for his son, something Evelyn had never been privy to. "Andrew," the note read, "you've always been ambitious, but you've never fully understood the value of what I've built. You've seen wealth as an end, not a means. I've set aside something for you, but it will come with conditions. If you want access to the resources I've left behind, you'll need to prove to me that you can handle them. You'll need to show responsibility and wisdom, not just desire. The legacy I've built for you is not a gift, but a responsibility." Evelyn's hands shook as she reread those words. Richard had left his son a legacy, yes, but it came with strings attached. Strings that Andrew would have to meet in order to unlock his inheritance. It was a lesson in responsibility, a challenge that Richard had set for his son. Evelyn had always known that Andrew had a certain entitlement about him, but she had never imagined that Richard had foreseen this and had actively planned to prevent Andrew from squandering the wealth he had so carefully built. For the first time, Evelyn understood the full depth of Richard's foresight. He had known that Andrew's desires could cloud his judgment. He had anticipated the very conflict that was now unfolding. Richard had set the stage for Evelyn to step in, to take control of the future they had built together, and to ensure that Andrew would one day learn the importance of balance, of respect, and of hard work. Evelyn closed the notebook with a sense of finality. It was clear now that Richard had left her with more than just memories. He had left her with the tools to protect their family's legacy. The question was, could she handle it? Could she live up to the expectations Richard had set, not just for her, but for Andrew as well? A stubborn son. The days following her discovery of Richard's hidden legacy were a whirlwind of emotion for Evelyn. She had spent countless hours poring over the documents, piecing together the fragments of a life that had been carefully constructed but largely kept from her view. The notebook, with its cryptic instructions for Andrew, had weighed heavily on her heart. Richard had been a man of foresight, but he had also been a man who had kept secrets from her. And now she understood why. But as much as Evelyn had been stunned by what she had uncovered, another battle was brewing, one she hadn't anticipated. Andrew's suggestion that she move out of the house, that she give up everything Richard had worked so hard to build, was the first of many decisions he would try to make for her. Andrew had always been a man of action, but Evelyn could see now that his ambitions and desires often clouded his judgment. He had never fully understood the value of what Richard had built, and now it seemed that Andrew was determined to get his hands on whatever he could, whether he was ready for it or not. The conflict between them had been simmering under the surface for days, but it came to a head one afternoon when Andrew dropped by to check on Evelyn. She had hoped that some time apart would give both of them the space to process their emotions, but instead, he seemed more determined than ever to push his agenda. "Mom, we need to talk," Andrew said, walking into the living room with the same sense of urgency he always carried with him. He didn't sit down immediately, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as if bracing for something. Evelyn looked up from the papers she had been organizing on the coffee table. She had been trying to focus on sorting through the bills, but her mind kept drifting back to the contents of the folder and notebook. She knew that Andrew's visit wasn't just to check on her. There was more on his mind. "What is it, Andrew?" she asked, her voice cautious but firm. She knew that this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't mean she was ready for it. "I've been thinking," Andrew began, his voice slightly shaky, "and I really believe it's time for you to make a decision about the house. We can't keep dragging this out." Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I've already told you, Andrew. I'm not ready to leave. This is where Richard and I built our life together. I'm not just going to pack up and leave because you think it's the best thing." Andrew's face tightened with frustration. "Mom, you don't understand. This house is falling apart. You've been patching it up for years, but it's only a matter of time before something big breaks down. It's just not worth keeping. It's too much for you to manage on your own." "I'm not an invalid, Andrew," Evelyn said, her voice rising a little. "I can still take care of myself. I'm not going to let you decide what's best for me. I know the house has its problems, but this is my home. It's all I have left of Richard." Andrew stood silently for a moment, the tension in the air thickening between them. Evelyn could see the frustration in his eyes, the impatience that had always been a part of him. But she also saw something else, a sense of entitlement, as if he believed that his view of the situation was the only valid one. It was this attitude that had always irked her, and now it felt more pronounced than ever. "I know you're upset, Mom," Andrew said, his voice softening slightly. "But you need to see the bigger picture. This house, these bills, it's all too much for you. You need to think about your future, and living here just isn't part of it. You can't keep holding on to something that isn't practical anymore." Evelyn shook her head, her hands trembling slightly. She stood up, her voice steady but firm. "I've heard enough, Andrew. This isn't just about a house. This is about you trying to control my life. Richard and I built this together, and I'm not going to let you come in and take it away from me. You don't get to make these decisions for me." Andrew's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might shout. But instead, he took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. "I'm just trying to help, Mom. You're not thinking clearly. You're not seeing what I see. I'm not trying to control you, but you need to face the reality of what's happening here." Evelyn could feel the sting of his words, the way he was dismissing her thoughts and feelings as if they didn't matter. It was clear to her now that Andrew had always thought he knew what was best for everyone. He had always been quick to make decisions, to act before considering the consequences, and now he was doing it again. The difference this time was that Evelyn wasn't going to let him dictate her future. "I don't need your help, Andrew," she said quietly. "What I need is respect. I need you to understand that this is my life, my decision. And if you can't respect that, then maybe it's time for you to leave." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Andrew stood frozen for a moment, staring at her as if trying to process what she had just said. But there was no apology in his eyes, no understanding. Instead, he just nodded slowly, as if he had heard it 100 times before. "I'll go," he said finally, his voice strained. "But don't expect me to just sit back and watch you ruin yourself, Mom. I'm only trying to help." Evelyn didn't respond. She just watched as he turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Evelyn was left alone, her heart racing in her chest. She had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. The anger that had flared up in Andrew had left her shaken, but more than that, it had left her with a deeper sense of resolve. Richard had always said that family was everything, that love and respect should guide all decisions. But Andrew had lost sight of that. His desire for control, for quick fixes, had clouded his ability to see what really mattered. Evelyn stood in the silence of the house, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't just fighting for a house, she was fighting for her dignity, for her right to make decisions about her own life. She wasn't ready to give up yet, not without a fight. Evelyn's quiet resilience. The days after her confrontation with Andrew were filled with a heavy stillness. Evelyn had spent so much of her life in the background, supporting Richard and Andrew, that she wasn't sure how to function without them. Richard was gone, and Andrew, in his own way, was pushing her toward a future she wasn't ready for. The house, their home, had become a battleground, one where Evelyn found herself fighting not just for the memories Richard had left her, but for the right to decide her own path. She spent most of her days going through the papers Richard had left behind. The discovery of his hidden legacy had been a shock, but it had also given her a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. The house may have been old and full of reminders of the life they had built together, but it was still hers. And she wasn't about to let Andrew, or anyone else, take that away from her. Though Evelyn had always been a quiet woman, she had never been a passive one. Over the years, she had quietly handled the day-to-day responsibilities of life. She had kept the house running smoothly, cooked the meals, handled the finances with Richard's guidance, and raised Andrew. She had never shied away from hard work or difficult decisions, but now, as she faced this new chapter in her life, it was as though she had to rediscover that inner strength, the resilience she had relied on all her life, but had only now realized she possessed in full measure. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn decided to take a walk. It wasn't just for exercise, it was for her sanity. She had been inside too long, lost in the world of documents and old memories. She needed to clear her mind, to breathe fresh air, and to remember what it felt like to simply be herself, not just the wife, mother, or widow, but a woman who still had her own desires and her own voice. The weather was cool for a late spring afternoon, the air fresh with the scent of blooming lilacs and fresh grass. As she walked along the garden path that Richard had tended to so lovingly, she couldn't help but smile. The garden was a mess now, wildflowers growing out of place, the hedges overgrown, but it was still a beautiful reminder of the love and care Richard had poured into every inch of their home. The garden had always been his pride, a place where he could escape the chaos of the world and lose himself in the dirt and the plants. Evelyn paused by a rose bush near the edge of the garden, where Richard had spent hours each year pruning and caring for the flowers. The rosebush had always been her favorite, its deep red blooms reminding her of the first bouquet Richard had given her on their first anniversary. She bent down to touch the petals, and for a moment, she let herself remember those early years, the days of laughter, the quiet moments when they had shared their dreams for the future. She stood there for a while, simply breathing, her heart slowing as the familiar sights and smells of the garden calmed her. The chaos of the past few weeks, the grief and the confusion, seemed to melt away. She was reminded of who she was, a woman who had faced hardship before, a woman who had always found a way through difficult times. She had been strong when Richard was sick, and she had been strong when Andrew was a child, even when things were hard. This too was something she could face. But it wasn't just the garden that brought her peace. It was the sense that she could take control again, that she didn't have to let her life be dictated by anyone else. The financial legacy Richard had left her gave her a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. She may not have understood all the technicalities of it at first, but she was beginning to learn. Richard had always been the planner, the one who knew exactly what needed to be done. But now, she was the one who would decide what came next. Back inside the house, Evelyn began to take action. She contacted a financial advisor, someone she had heard Richard mention a few times in passing but had never met. She also reached out to a lawyer, just to make sure that she understood the full scope of what Richard had left for her. There was a lot to go through, but Evelyn was determined to understand it all. She wasn't going to let Andrew, or anyone else, decide her future for her. This was her time to make her own choices. Andrew continued to call, but Evelyn didn't return his messages right away. She knew he meant well, but he was still thinking of her as the woman who needed protecting, the woman who couldn't manage on her own. He didn't understand that she had already been managing all these years, that she had quietly held their world together, even when things seemed impossible. One afternoon, Andrew showed up at the house, his face drawn with concern. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some financial papers when he entered. He stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice softer this time, less forceful than before. "I'm just worried about you. I know you've been through a lot, and I just want to make sure you're okay." Evelyn put down the papers, meeting his gaze. She could see the genuine concern in his eyes, but she also knew that this was his way of trying to fix things, of trying to take control. She wasn't sure how to handle it, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. "I'm fine, Andrew," she said quietly, but firmly. "I'm learning to handle things on my own. I've been doing it all these years, you know. Richard and I built this life together, and I'm not going to let it slip away just because you think I'm not capable of taking care of myself." Andrew looked at her, his jaw tightening. "Mom, I just want you to be safe. You don't have to do this alone." "I'm not alone," she replied, her voice steady. "I've got everything I need right here, and I'm learning what Richard left behind. It's time for me to stand up for myself, to make my own decisions." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Andrew nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I guess I don't know everything, do I?" he said, almost to himself. "Maybe I've been thinking about this all wrong." Evelyn nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope, Maybe there was a way forward after all, a way for both of them to move forward with respect for each other and for the life they had shared with Richard. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. As Andrew left, promising to give her space to sort things out, Evelyn felt a quiet strength rising within her. She wasn't just moving on from Richard's death, she was reclaiming her life. And with every step she took, she felt more like the woman she had always been, strong, resilient, and capable of handling whatever came her way. Richard's hidden truth. As Evelyn continued to sort through the papers and financial documents Richard had left behind, she began to uncover pieces of his life that she had never known. Richard had always been a man of few words when it came to their financial matters. He had handled the money, managed their accounts, and taken care of all the practical aspects of life while she focused on the home and family. But now, as she examined the documents one by one, Evelyn realized that Richard had been far more than just the provider she had always thought him to be. He had been a silent architect, carefully crafting their future with foresight and precision, ensuring that his family would be taken care of long after he was gone. Evelyn had discovered Richard's portfolio of real estate investments and business dealings, but it wasn't until she stumbled upon a small, leather-bound folder hidden behind a row of tax documents that she realized just how far Richard's planning had gone. The folder was marked with a simple label, "For Evelyn." The words were written in Richard's familiar handwriting, and her heart skipped a beat as she carefully opened it. Inside, she found a detailed breakdown of their financial holdings, along with an unexpected surprise: Richard's private investments in several high-profile companies. These weren't the ordinary rental properties she had seen earlier. These were larger, more ambitious ventures, startups, tech companies, and even some stock market holdings. Evelyn had always assumed that Richard's investments were limited to the properties they owned, but now she saw the scope of his business dealings, and she was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all. But what caught her attention most were the letters. 3 letters, each addressed to her, dated over the course of several years. The first letter was dated 10 years ago, shortly after Richard had been diagnosed with a mild heart condition. At the time, Evelyn had thought it was just a precautionary measure, but reading it now, she realized that Richard had been planning for the worst long before his sudden death. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. I have spent my life ensuring that you will be secure, that you and Andrew will have everything you need to live comfortably. I have kept many things from you over the years, not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't want you to carry the burden of these decisions. I have made arrangements for the future, both for you and for Andrew. But there is something I must tell you now, something you must know." Evelyn paused, her hands trembling as she read the words. Richard had known he might not be around forever, but she never imagined that he had prepared for his death so thoroughly, so carefully. It was both comforting and unsettling to think that he had thought of everything, even the things she had never considered. The letter went on to explain the financial strategy Richard had devised for her. It was simple in a way, yet it was designed to ensure her independence and security. Richard had set up a series of trusts, investments, and assets that would automatically transfer to her name upon his passing. He had also taken steps to minimize taxes and legal hurdles, knowing that these matters could become complicated if he were to die unexpectedly. The level of detail was astonishing. Richard had anticipated everything, from future medical expenses to Andrew's financial needs. But as Evelyn read on, she discovered something else. Something that struck her deeply. Richard had left specific instructions for Andrew, instructions that were not just about money, but about life. He had known Andrew's tendency to act impulsively, to pursue wealth for its own sake. and he had made provisions to ensure that his son wouldn't squander the family's fortune. It was a difficult truth for Evelyn to accept, but she couldn't deny it. Richard had seen things in Andrew that she had never wanted to acknowledge, and he had acted accordingly. "The trust I have set up for Andrew will only be accessible to him once he has demonstrated responsibility," the letter continued. "He is a good boy, Evelyn, but he has always been driven by a desire for more wealth, more power, more things. I fear that he does not yet understand the true value of what I've built, of what we've worked for. I hope that with time, he will learn. But until then, I've set conditions for his inheritance. He must prove that he can manage it wisely, that he can balance ambition with responsibility, before I allow him access to the resources I've left him. I do this not to punish him, but to protect him." Evelyn's heart sank as she read Richard's words. She had always known that Andrew had a certain entitlement about him, a belief that things should come easily, that wealth and success were his by right. But to hear Richard acknowledge it so plainly, to know that he had taken steps to safeguard Andrew from his own impulses, was a sobering reality. It wasn't that Richard didn't love his son, he did deeply. But Richard had also recognized that Andrew's view of the world was one-sided, that he needed to grow and mature before he could fully inherit the responsibilities that came with the family's wealth. Evelyn felt a deep sense of gratitude for Richard's foresight, but also a heavy burden. She now understood the full extent of what he had left her, and what he had left Andrew. It wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, about the values Richard had instilled in their family, and about the future they would build together. But it also meant that Evelyn had a responsibility now, one that she wasn't entirely prepared for. The second letter, dated a year later, was more personal. In it, Richard wrote about his love for Evelyn, his appreciation for the life they had shared, and his hopes for her happiness after his death. He acknowledged the pain she would feel, the grief that would inevitably follow, but he also reminded her that she was strong, that she had always been the heart of their family. He wanted her to live her life, to find joy, and to never feel as if she had to live in the shadow of his absence. The final letter, dated just 6 months before his death, was a simple note of reassurance. "Evelyn," it read, "I know you will be okay. You have always been capable, and you are stronger than you think. Trust yourself. And remember, no matter what happens, you are never truly alone. I will always be with you." Evelyn closed the folder, the weight of Richard's words settling deep in her chest. She had known that Richard loved her, but she had never realized the depth of his thoughtfulness, the extent to which he had prepared for everything. He had given her the tools to carry on, to make decisions, and to ensure the family's legacy lived on. But now, it was up to her to honor that legacy, to protect what they had built together. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but as she sat in the quiet study, surrounded by the documents and letters Richard had left behind, Evelyn felt a quiet strength building within her. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was his partner, his equal, entrusted with the future of their family. And she was ready to step into that role. The heart-to-heart Evelyn had never imagined that her life would come to this, a place where she would be forced to take control, to fight for the life she and Richard had built. But here she was, standing on the edge of something new, something unfamiliar. She had spent the better part of her life following Richard's lead, letting him handle the tough decisions, trusting him to guide their family through the complexities of life. Now, with Richard gone, Evelyn had no choice but to step into the role he had left behind. The past few days had been a whirlwind. She had absorbed the shock of his death, uncovered the unexpected wealth he had left her, and confronted Andrew about his demands. But in all of this, one thing had been left unsaid: the truth about what she really wanted, what she truly needed from Andrew. She had been too focused on the mechanics of survival, on protecting her legacy, to address the emotional side of everything that had happened. And now, she knew it was time. It was late one afternoon when Andrew showed up at the house again. This time, he didn't burst in with his usual urgency. He came quietly, his eyes reflecting the weight of the past few days. The tension that had existed between them was still palpable, but there was something different in his posture, a sense of hesitation, of uncertainty. It was clear that he wasn't the same confident son who had stormed into the house weeks earlier with the assumption that he knew what was best for everyone. Evelyn had been sitting in the kitchen, sipping her tea, when she saw Andrew's car pull into the driveway. He walked up to the front door and stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath before knocking gently. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but she wasn't sure what to expect from him this time. When she opened the door, Andrew looked at her with a mixture of guilt and concern. He was holding a small envelope in his hand, his fingers clenched tightly around it. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a wall. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "What is it, Andrew?" she asked softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "What do you want to talk about?" He hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, holding out the envelope. "I know I've been pushing you, Mom," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "And I've been wrong. I didn't realize what I was doing until now. I just thought I knew what was best for you. But I can see now that I've been selfish. I've been so focused on my own concerns that I didn't stop to think about what you need." Evelyn took the envelope, unsure of what was inside, but grateful for the shift in Andrew's tone. It wasn't the same defensiveness she had heard in their last conversation. It was something more, humility, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Andrew continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I don't always get it right. I've always been quick to act, to try to fix things without really listening. And I know that I hurt you when I suggested you leave the house, when I tried to take control of everything. I was wrong, Mom. I'm sorry." Evelyn felt a knot in her throat as she listened to her son's words. She had spent so many years protecting him, guiding him, trying to shelter him from the harsh realities of the world. But now, as he stood there, admitting his mistakes, she realized that perhaps it was her turn to listen, to really listen. She opened the envelope slowly, taking in the carefully folded paper inside. It was a letter, another letter, like the ones Richard had written to her. But this one wasn't from Richard. It was from Andrew. As she unfolded it, Evelyn's heart swelled with a mixture of sadness and hope. The letter read, "Mom, I know I've let you down. I've always wanted to make you proud, but I've often gone about it the wrong way. I've spent so much time trying to chase after things that I thought would make me happy, but I see now that it's not about the things we have. It's about the people we love. And I love you, Mom. I'm sorry for everything I've said and done to hurt you. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to push you away anymore. You've been my rock, my support, and I've taken that for granted. I don't know if I can ever make up for the mistakes I've made, but I'm willing to try. If you're willing to give me the chance, I'll do whatever it takes to be the son you deserve." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes as she finished reading the letter. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Andrew saw beyond his own desires, when he recognized the importance of family, of love, of responsibility. He wasn't the same impulsive young man who had tried to make decisions for her without understanding the full picture. He was growing, changing, and learning. And though it hurt, Evelyn realized that it was this process, this journey of growth, that was going to shape their future. She looked up at Andrew, who was standing by the door, waiting for her response. His eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was also a glimmer of hope. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart filled with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "Andrew," she began softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I'm proud of you. You've taken the first step toward understanding what really matters. And that's all I've ever wanted, to see you grow, to see you find your way." Andrew's face softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were standing together in the same room, no longer separated by resentment or misunderstanding. There was still work to be done, still challenges ahead, but in this moment, Evelyn felt a sense of connection with her son that had been missing for years. "I'm not going anywhere, Andrew," she continued, her voice firm but kind. "I'm here. I always will be. But we're going to do this together. We're going to find a way to move forward, to honor your father's legacy, and to create our own future. And that means we're going to make decisions together. No more pushing each other away." Andrew nodded, his eyes bright with tears. "I don't deserve this, Mom, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try harder, for you, for Dad, for us." Evelyn reached out and pulled Andrew into a hug, something they hadn't shared in years. She didn't know if everything would be perfect from this point on, but she knew that they had taken the first step toward understanding, toward healing, and toward building a future together. As they stood there, in the warmth of the kitchen, Evelyn realized that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more hard conversations, more moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was no longer alone. She had her son back, and together they would find their way through the storm. A lesson in family. The weeks that followed the heart-to-heart between Evelyn and Andrew marked a turning point in their relationship. There was no sudden magic, no quick fix to the emotional distance that had existed between them for so long, but there was progress. And sometimes, that was all one could ask for. Evelyn had always believed in the power of family. It was the foundation of her life, the glue that had held everything together through the years. She had believed that love, mutual respect, and understanding were the pillars upon which strong relationships were built. And yet, over the years, she had come to realize that family wasn't always as simple as it seemed. Love could be messy. Respect could be tested. And understanding sometimes required more than just good intentions. Andrew's admission of his mistakes, his willingness to listen and grow, had been a small but significant step forward. Evelyn knew that this was the beginning of something better, not just for her and Andrew, but for their entire family. It wasn't about her being right or him being wrong. It was about finding common ground, about respecting each other's journeys, and about acknowledging the shared history that had shaped both of their lives. Evelyn couldn't ignore the fact that Andrew still had a long way to go. His ambition, his desire for more, was still very much a part of who he was. But now, there was a recognition that those desires needed to be tempered with responsibility. And for the first time, Evelyn felt that Andrew was truly open to that idea. As the days passed, she noticed a shift in their interactions. Andrew began to spend more time at the house, not just to check on her, but to help with the things that Richard had always done. He started showing interest in the properties Richard had left behind, asking questions about the investments, the financial strategy Richard had put in place. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about understanding the legacy that Richard had built and what it meant for the family. Evelyn had always known that Andrew had a certain entitlement about him, but now she was seeing a more grounded side to him, a side that recognized the weight of the responsibility that came with their shared history. One evening, after dinner, as they sat together in the living room, Andrew turned to Evelyn with a thoughtful expression. He had been quiet for most of the evening, lost in thought, and Evelyn could tell that he was processing something. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice tentative but sincere. "About how we're supposed to honor Dad's legacy. It's not just about taking control of everything and trying to fix it all. It's about understanding what he wanted for us. And I think I've been missing that." Evelyn's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. For so long, she had tried to communicate that same message, but it had always felt like Andrew wasn't truly hearing it. Now, she could see that he was beginning to understand. "I've been so focused on my own idea of success," Andrew continued, "that I lost sight of what really matters. I've spent so much of my life trying to prove something, trying to make up for what I thought I lacked. But what I realize now is that Dad didn't just want us to have things. He wanted us to be responsible, to understand the value of what we've been given. And I've got a lot of work to do, if I'm going to live up to that." Evelyn felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She didn't want Andrew to see her vulnerability, but in this moment, she couldn't help it. The pain she had carried for so long, the fear that Andrew might never truly understand, was beginning to ease. This was the breakthrough she had hoped for. This was the moment when Andrew was beginning to see the bigger picture. "I'm proud of you, Andrew," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "You don't know how much it means to hear you say that. For so long, I've been carrying this burden, trying to protect you, trying to protect what Richard and I built. But now, I can see that you're ready to understand what really matters." Andrew nodded, his eyes shining with sincerity. "I want to be a better son, Mom. I want to be someone you can be proud of, not just because of what I achieve, but because I do it the right way." Evelyn smiled through her tears, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but this was the beginning of something new. She and Andrew were finding their way back to each other, and that was more than she could have asked for. But the lessons of family didn't end with Andrew. As Evelyn reflected on her journey, she realized that the concept of family had always been more than just blood relations. Family was about connection, understanding, and the willingness to stand by each other, even when things got difficult. She had spent so much of her life focusing on taking care of others that she had forgotten to take care of herself. And now, she was beginning to learn that in order to truly be there for her family, she had to take ownership of her own life, her own future. Richard had left her with more than just a financial legacy. He had left her with the tools to protect and nurture her family. But it was up to her now to decide how to use those tools. She didn't have to do everything alone. She had Andrew, and together they could build a future that honored Richard's memory and their shared values. As Evelyn sat in the living room, surrounded by the memories of her life with Richard, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She wasn't alone. She wasn't fighting this battle by herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. She wasn't just Richard's wife or Andrew's mother anymore. She was Evelyn, a woman with strength, with purpose, and with the resilience to navigate whatever came next. "I'm ready," Evelyn whispered to herself, a sense of calm settling over her. "Ready to move forward, ready to honor what we've built, and ready to make decisions for myself." And with that, Evelyn knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and love that had always defined her family. The turning point. The days after Evelyn's heart-to-heart with Andrew were both peaceful and unsettling. It wasn't that things had miraculously fixed themselves, far from it, but there was a shift in the air, a shift that Evelyn felt in the deepest parts of her heart. For the first time in months, she began to feel that she might be able to breathe again, that she could handle the future with confidence. Yet, there was still a lingering unease, a question hanging over everything. Could Andrew truly change? Could he fully embrace the responsibility his father had left behind, not just in terms of wealth, but in the lessons that came with it? Evelyn spent hours reflecting on the past, considering the choices that had led her to this point. She thought about Richard, his quiet wisdom, his love for her, and his foresight. She thought about Andrew, his impulsive nature, his desire for more, and his willingness to take shortcuts. And in those moments of reflection, she realized something profound. She couldn't protect Andrew forever. She couldn't shield him from the consequences of his own actions. It was time for him to face the hard truths, to understand that the world wasn't as simple as he had once believed. But how could she get him to see that? How could she help him grow into the man she knew he could be, the man his father had hoped he would become? One cold afternoon, the answer arrived in the most unexpected way. Evelyn was sitting in the study, surrounded by papers and documents as usual, trying to get a better understanding of the investments Richard had left behind. As she flipped through the papers, something caught her eye, a name she hadn't seen before. It was the name of a company Richard had invested in years ago, a company that seemed to be on the brink of a breakthrough. The financial records indicated that the company had recently experienced a major setback, something Richard had never mentioned. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to make Evelyn pause. Her curiosity piqued. Evelyn began to dig deeper into the company's background. What she found shocked her. Richard had been heavily invested in a startup that, at the time, seemed to be on the verge of something big. However, the company had made some questionable decisions in the months before his death, decisions that, had they not been carefully managed, could have led to serious financial trouble. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if this was one of the reasons Richard had kept so much from her. He had been protecting her, not just from the pressures of managing their finances, but from the uncertainty of the world he had built around them. Evelyn picked up the phone and dialed the number of the company's CEO, a man named Thomas Caldwell. She had never met him, but his name had appeared several times in Richard's documents. He was listed as the head of the company, the one who had led them through both triumph and failure. The call went through, and she was met with a polite voice on the other end. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hayes," Thomas said, his tone professional. "How can I assist you today?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then decided to dive right in. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Evelyn Hayes, Richard Hayes' widow. I've come across some information regarding the company, and I'd like to understand more about the recent issues the company has faced. I'm concerned about the investments my husband made, and I believe you may be the best person to help me understand what happened." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Of course, Ms. Hayes," Thomas said. "I can tell you that things have been difficult. We've had some setbacks with production and funding, but I assure you, we're doing everything we can to turn things around. Your husband had full confidence in our company, and I'm still working on his behalf to honor that trust." Evelyn's mind raced. She had suspected that Richard had been covering for something, but hearing Thomas speak so directly about it confirmed her fears. She needed to know more, to understand how deep this issue went. "Is there anything specific that I should know?" she pressed. her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. Thomas hesitated again. "There's a risk involved, Ms. Hayes. A significant one. If we can't secure additional funding or make some serious changes to our strategy, the company could face liquidation. Your husband had a stake in this company, and we've been doing everything in our power to protect that investment, but I can't promise anything." Evelyn took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had inherited much more than she had realized. Richard's legacy was not just about wealth. It was also about navigating the risks and uncertainties he had faced. She wasn't just holding on to a stable life. She was holding on to the hopes and dreams of a man who had built something far more complicated than she had understood. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Caldwell," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "I need some time to process this, but I assure you, I will not let Richard's work go to waste." She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, staring at the papers in front of her. The reality of the situation hit her hard. She wasn't just a widow who had inherited her husband's estate. She was now a businesswoman, a decision-maker. The fate of Richard's investments, his legacy, rested in her hands. It was up to her to decide what came next. But then, as if on cue, the phone rang again. This time it was Andrew. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, "I need to talk to you. It's about the company, about Dad's investments." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea how much Andrew had been involved in this, but hearing his voice now, she realized that this might be the turning point she had been waiting for. "Andrew, I've just spoken with Thomas Caldwell," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "It seems there's more going on with the company than we thought. We need to make some decisions, and I need you to be involved." There was a pause on the other end. "I don't know what I can do, Mom," Andrew admitted. "I've never really understood all this business stuff. But I know one thing. I don't want to let Dad's legacy fall apart. If there's a way we can fix this, I'm in." Evelyn felt a surge of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long time, Andrew was offering more than just words. He was offering his support, his willingness to be a part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't the solution she had expected, but it was the one she needed. "This is a turning point for both of us, Andrew," Evelyn said softly. "We'll figure this out together. For your father. For our future." As she looked out the window, Evelyn realized that she had reached a pivotal moment in her life. She had always been the caretaker, the one who held things together. But now, she was stepping into a new role, one where her decisions would shape the future. The future wasn't certain, but Evelyn knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let fear or uncertainty stop her. She was ready to take charge, to make the hard decisions, and to ensure that Richard's legacy would live on. Rediscovering self-worth. The days that followed Evelyn's conversation with Andrew marked a turning point, not only for their relationship, but for Evelyn herself. For so long, she had existed in the shadow of others' needs, Richard's, Andrew's, and had quietly, without complaint, played her role as the caregiver, the support system. But now, with Richard gone, and Andrew beginning to understand the weight of the responsibilities ahead, Evelyn found herself at a crossroads. This was no longer about preserving the past or maintaining the status quo. It was about finding her own voice, about reclaiming her own sense of self-worth, and stepping into the future with strength and clarity. The financial legacy Richard had left behind was a heavy burden to carry. Evelyn had always relied on Richard's decisions, his careful management of their life together, and though she had been aware of the surface-level aspects of their financial life, she had never truly understood the depth of his foresight. But now, as she sat in the study, going over the business documents and investment portfolios, she felt something stirring within her, a sense of capability, of competence, that she hadn't realized she still possessed. It was as though the pieces of her life, which had once felt like a scattered puzzle, were slowly coming together. For the first time, Evelyn wasn't just doing things because they needed to be done. She was making decisions because she had the power to do so. The thought of handling Richard's investments, making sure Andrew understood the gravity of the situation, was no longer a source of dread. Instead, it was empowering. She could see Richard's vision clearly now, not just the financial strategy, but the love, the care, the protection he had wanted to offer her, even in his absence. But as the weeks went by, Evelyn began to understand something even more profound. It wasn't just about money, or legacy, or property. It was about reclaiming her own life, her own independence. For years she had let herself be defined by her roles as a wife and a mother. And while those roles had been important, they had also limited her. She had put everyone else's needs first, but in doing so, she had forgotten to care for herself, to acknowledge her own worth, beyond the labels of wife and mother. She wasn't sure when it had started, the slow erosion of her own sense of self. Perhaps it had been when Richard's health had begun to decline, or when Andrew had become more independent and distant. Or maybe it had been the weight of taking care of everything, every day, without ever asking for help. But now, as she sorted through the papers and made phone calls to the financial advisors and lawyers, she realized that she had been living in a way that had almost erased her sense of self-worth. She had been doing everything for everyone else, without ever stopping to ask herself what she needed, what she wanted. It was one quiet evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle outside the window, that Evelyn had a moment of clarity. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, when she realized that she had spent too many years living in reaction to others. She had been reacting to Richard's needs, to Andrew's needs, to the demands of life. But now, it was her turn. It was her time to decide what came next, to carve out a future that wasn't just about preserving the past, but about creating something new. She had spent so much of her life being the other half, the one who supported, the one who helped, the one who made things work behind the scenes. But now Evelyn realized that she was more than that. She was capable, intelligent, and strong, with her own set of dreams, desires, and goals. Richard had always believed in her. He had left her with everything he could to ensure she would be taken care of. But in all of this, he had also left her a legacy of resilience, of hard work, of love. It was time for her to believe in herself the way he had believed in her. The next day, Evelyn called Andrew into the living room. She had spent the night thinking deeply, and she knew what she had to do. It was time to have a conversation that wasn't about money or business or legacy. It was time to talk about family, about their future, and about the importance of understanding and respect. When Andrew arrived, he was surprised to find Evelyn sitting calmly, her posture relaxed but firm. It wasn't like the times before when she had been overwhelmed, or uncertain, or unsure of herself. This time, Evelyn felt clear-headed and focused, ready to have the conversation she had been avoiding for so long. "Andrew," she began, her voice steady, "we've been through a lot these past few weeks. A lot of emotions, a lot of hard conversations. But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about what Richard left behind, or about protecting our legacy. It's about us, about our family. And it's time we start treating each other with the respect we deserve." Andrew looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and curiosity. He had never seen his mother like this before, so calm, so centered. "Mom," he said slowly, "I know I've been difficult. I know I've pushed you, and I'm sorry. But I don't really understand. What do you mean by respect?" Evelyn took a deep breath. She had asked herself the same question many times. What did respect really mean? It wasn't just about saying the right things or doing the right things. It was about understanding, about recognizing each other's worth, about knowing that both people in a relationship, whether as family, friends, or partners, deserve to be heard, to be understood, and to be valued. Respect means understanding that we all have our own path, our own journey, Evelyn explained, her voice soft but firm. It means recognizing that your father and I built this life together, but now I need to take responsibility for my part. I need to make decisions for myself, and I need you to support me in that. It's not just about the money, Andrew. It's about me standing up for myself, for my own future. And I want you to be a part of that. But I can't do it if I'm not allowed to stand on my own. Andrew stood still for a moment, processing her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I get it now, Mom. I'm sorry for not seeing that before. I've been so focused on what I thought was best that I didn't realize what you needed." Evelyn smiled, the weight of the conversation lifting off her shoulders. This wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning. But she knew now that, together, they would find their way. They would create a future that was built on mutual respect, love, and the understanding that both of them had their own unique paths to follow. In that moment, Evelyn realized that rediscovering her self-worth wasn't just about reclaiming her life from Andrew's expectations or Richard's legacy. It was about reclaiming the power to make her own decisions, to live her own life, and to know that no matter what came next, she was enough. A forgiving heart. As the weeks passed, Evelyn found herself standing at the crossroads of forgiveness, both for herself and for others. The journey she had undertaken since Richard's death had been far more complex than she could have ever imagined. She had uncovered hidden truths, confronted uncomfortable realities, and wrestled with emotions she had long buried. And yet, through it all, there was one thing she had not yet fully reckoned with: the need to forgive. Forgiveness, Evelyn knew, wasn't a simple or easy thing. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the hurts didn't matter. It was about letting go of the bitterness that could poison her soul, about making peace with the things she couldn't change. It was about freeing herself from the anger, the regret, and the resentment that had kept her bound in a silent prison for so long. In the quiet moments, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the pain she had carried for years, the pain of feeling unseen, unheard, and overlooked. She had given everything to her family, to Richard, to Andrew, to the house they had built together. But in all of this, she had neglected to care for the most important person of all, herself. She had let herself become defined by the roles she played: wife, mother, caretaker. And in doing so, she had lost sight of who she was beneath those labels. But now, as she sat in the solitude of the study, surrounded by the letters and papers Richard had left behind, Evelyn realized something profound. She had spent so much time focusing on the past, on the things that had been taken from her, that she had neglected to look forward. The future was not something to fear or resist, it was something to embrace. But in order to do that, she had to let go of the past. The first step, Evelyn realized, was forgiving Richard. She had spent so much of her time holding on to the grief of losing him, the anger at the secrets he had kept from her, the resentment of the choices he had made without consulting her. But now, looking at his letters, she saw him through a different lens. She saw the love he had for her, the ways he had tried to protect her, even when he hadn't shared all the details. He had been a man of pride, of quiet strength, but also of vulnerability. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had done the best he could with the tools he had. Evelyn could see that now. And in that moment, she understood that forgiveness wasn't about excusing his actions. It was about letting go of the bitterness that had clouded her heart. It was about making peace with the fact that Richard was gone, that the past couldn't be rewritten, and that holding on to the pain would only prevent her from moving forward. The second step, she realized, was forgiving Andrew. The conflict between them had been painful, and for a long time, Evelyn had felt that her son's behavior was a direct challenge to her own authority, her worth, and her role as a mother. He had been impulsive, selfish, and stubborn, and those traits had hurt her deeply. But over the weeks, she had seen something shift in him. Andrew had started to understand the depth of his actions, to see the ways he had taken her for granted, and he had begun to open up to the possibility of change. Forgiving Andrew didn't mean excusing his mistakes or pretending that the hurt he caused didn't matter. It meant acknowledging that he too was on a journey, one that he had to walk for himself, but that she could support him on. It meant recognizing that he had his own struggles, his own flaws, and that he was capable of growth, just as she was. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat in the garden, her hands resting on the cool stone of the patio table, she realized that forgiveness had to start with herself. She had spent so much of her life carrying the weight of other people's expectations, of putting everyone else's needs before her own, that she had forgotten to forgive herself. She had made mistakes, too. She had neglected her own well-being, pushed her own dreams to the side, and allowed herself to be defined by others. But now, she was ready to make amends with herself. Forgiving herself meant acknowledging that it was okay to have made mistakes. It meant understanding that she wasn't perfect, and that she didn't have to be. She had done her best with the circumstances she had been given, and that was enough. It was time to let go of the guilt, the self-blame, and the regret that had held her back for so long. She had lived a life full of love, full of sacrifice, and now it was time to reclaim her sense of self-worth. As Evelyn sat there, the cool breeze rustling the leaves in the trees above her, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The weight she had been carrying for so long was slowly lifting. Forgiveness wasn't a one-time event. It was a process, a continual act of letting go, of releasing the grip of the past so that she could move forward into the future. That evening after dinner, Evelyn called Andrew into the living room. She had been thinking about this moment for days. And now, she was ready. She had forgiven him, and she wanted him to know it. She wanted him to understand that the past was behind them, and that they could move forward, together, with love and respect. When Andrew entered the room, he looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She could see that he wasn't sure what to expect, but he had been respectful lately, and that gave her hope. "Andrew," she began, her voice steady but warm, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want you to know that I forgive you. I forgive you for the things you've said, for the decisions you've tried to make for me. I know you've been trying to help, but I also know that I've been hurt by some of your actions." Andrew looked down, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "I know I've messed up, and I don't deserve your forgiveness." Evelyn reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Andrew, forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about healing. It's about letting go of the anger and the hurt so that we can move forward. I forgive you because I want us to have a future together, one where we support each other, where we learn and grow, and where we respect each other." Andrew's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. "I'll try, Mom. I'll do better. I promise." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with love for her son. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but in this moment she felt a sense of calm, of closure. She had forgiven, and in doing so she had freed herself and Andrew from the burden of the past. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Evelyn realized that forgiveness wasn't just about others, it was about herself. And as she let go of the pain, the resentment, and the regret, she made room for love, for healing, and for a future filled with hope. Reclaiming power, Evelyn stood in the center of her living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like an empty shell, like a space filled only with memories. It felt like home again, filled with potential, with the promise of a future that was yet to be written. The weight of Richard's death, of Andrew's mistakes, of the years of holding things together for others, was beginning to lift. Evelyn had rediscovered her strength, her independence, and now she was ready to take the reins of her future. It was time to reclaim the power that had always been hers, but that she had forgotten she had. The financial legacy Richard had left behind was vast, and though Evelyn had been overwhelmed by the sheer amount of responsibility that came with it, she was beginning to understand that she was more than capable of handling it. She had been Richard's partner, his equal, even if she hadn't always seen it that way. And now, with his guidance through his carefully organized papers, his meticulous planning, Evelyn knew that it was time for her to take the lead. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even just about the properties or the investments. It was about making decisions that would shape her life, her family's future, and her own sense of purpose. For so long, she had let herself be defined by others, by Richard's strength, by Andrew's needs, by the roles she had played. But now, Evelyn realized, it was time to define herself. She wasn't just Richard's widow. She wasn't just Andrew's mother. She was Evelyn Hayes, a woman with her own dreams, her own path to follow. The first step in reclaiming her power came as she sat down with Andrew. They had come a long way since their heated arguments, since the days of misunderstanding and resentment. There was still much to work through, but there was a sense of mutual respect between them now, a respect that hadn't been there before. They had learned to listen to each other, to understand one another's perspectives. And for the first time, Evelyn felt that Andrew was ready to understand not just her, but the full weight of what she had been carrying. "Andrew," she said softly one afternoon as they sat together at the kitchen table, "I've been thinking about the future, about everything that's ahead of us. And I want you to know that I'm ready to take control of it, to make the decisions that will guide us forward." Andrew looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "What do you mean, Mom?" he asked cautiously. "Are you talking about the house, the investments?" Evelyn nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, but also more than that. This is about us, about our family's legacy. I've spent too much of my life waiting for others to decide for me. But now, I'm ready to make my own choices. I'm not going to let anyone, whether it's you or anyone else, make those decisions for me anymore." Andrew looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. "I get it, Mom. I do. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I've been pushing you, trying to take control. But you're right. This isn't just about what's best for me. It's about what's best for you, too." Evelyn smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief wash over her. This wasn't easy for either of them. They had both been tested in ways they never expected. But in this moment, Evelyn felt like they had crossed an important threshold, They were moving forward, together, but with a newfound respect for each other's autonomy. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, Andrew," Evelyn continued. "But I want you to be involved. I want you to learn and understand what Richard and I built. We're in this together, but we both have to be accountable for the choices we make. I need you to trust me, and I need to trust you." Andrew sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I do trust you, Mom. I've just been so focused on trying to fix things, to make sure everything works out the way I want it to. But I know now that I can't do that without understanding everything first. And I'll be there with you, every step of the way." Evelyn felt a surge of pride in her son. He was still young, still learning, but in that moment, she saw the potential in him. He wasn't the same impulsive young man who had tried to take over her life. He was growing, evolving, and it gave her hope for the future. But even more than that, it gave her the strength to move forward with her own decisions, knowing that Andrew was willing to stand beside her, not above her, but beside her. As they continued to talk, Evelyn laid out a plan for the future. It wasn't a perfect plan, and it wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. But it was a starting point. They would begin by addressing the most pressing issues, the properties that needed attention, the investments that needed to be managed. Evelyn would take the lead, but she wouldn't do it alone. Andrew would learn alongside her, helping with the decisions, offering his perspective. They would create a team, a partnership that honored both of their strengths. That evening, after Andrew left for the night, Evelyn sat alone in the living room, looking out at the stars through the window. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not because everything was perfect, but because she had finally stepped into her own power. She had been given a gift, a legacy, that she could now mold into something that was uniquely her own. She wasn't just carrying the weight of the past anymore. She was creating the future. It wasn't about wealth or status. It wasn't about controlling everything. It was about making choices, choices that reflected her values, her desires, her strengths. It was about doing the work day by day and knowing that she was capable of making it all work, just as Richard had made it work for so many years. As Evelyn leaned back in her chair, she smiled to herself. She had made it through the storm. She had learned to forgive, to trust, and to reclaim the power that had always been within her reach. And now, she was ready to build a future that honored Richard's legacy and her own. New beginnings. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow across the room. Evelyn stood at the stove, her hands stirring a pot of oatmeal, but her mind was elsewhere. The past several months had been filled with so many changes, so much reflection, so much healing. Richard's death had initially thrown her life into chaos, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life that suddenly felt fragmented. But now, Evelyn felt a shift within herself, a sense of possibility, a sense of renewal that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the business decisions she had made or the legacy she had inherited. It wasn't even just about Andrew's growth and the bond they were beginning to rebuild. It was about her own personal transformation, about finding her strength again, and reclaiming her life on her own terms. The path ahead was still uncertain, and there were many more decisions to be made, but Evelyn felt ready. Ready to embrace this new chapter of her life, ready to step out of the shadow of the past and step into a future that was full of promise. She had spent so many years living for others, first for Richard, then for Andrew, always putting their needs ahead of her own. But now, for the first time, Evelyn realized that it was okay to live for herself. She didn't have to sacrifice her own dreams and desires to take care of others. In fact, taking care of herself was the first step toward being able to help those she loved. The house, once a place of sorrow and confusion, was now beginning to feel like home again. It was still Richard's house in many ways. His presence was woven into every corner, every memory, every detail of the place. But Evelyn no longer felt trapped by the past. She had come to terms with Richard's absence, with the fact that she had to forge ahead on her own. She wasn't moving on from him, but she was moving forward with him in her heart, carrying the lessons he had taught her. As she set the table for breakfast, Evelyn couldn't help but think about all that had changed. The house was quieter without Richard's booming laugh, without his presence filling the rooms. But it was also quieter in a way that allowed Evelyn to hear her own voice more clearly. She wasn't being swept along by life anymore. She was making decisions, taking charge, and rediscovering who she was. Andrew, too, had changed. The young man who had once been so focused on his own desires, so quick to push his mother out of the way, was now showing a deeper understanding of the world. It hadn't been easy. There had been plenty of arguments, plenty of moments when it felt like they were at an impasse. But through it all, Evelyn had seen him begin to mature, to take responsibility for his actions, and to recognize the importance of family. They had learned to communicate better, to respect each other's boundaries, and to acknowledge the weight of the legacy Richard had left them. Evelyn had given Andrew the space to grow, to learn from his mistakes, but she had also made it clear that he could no longer take her for granted. She had reclaimed her power. And now, she was sharing that power with Andrew, not in a way that made him feel like he was being controlled, but in a way that allowed him to be part of something greater than himself. Together, they were beginning to rebuild their family, brick by brick, with respect, understanding, and a shared vision for the future. Evelyn had also made the difficult decision to keep the house. After much contemplation, she had decided that this was where she wanted to stay, where she wanted to continue living. It wasn't about holding on to the past, but about creating a future that honored what had been built here. The house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of everything she and Richard had shared, everything they had worked for. And now, it was a symbol of her strength, her resilience, and her willingness to move forward with purpose. The house needed repairs, of course. There were rooms that needed to be repainted, the garden that needed tending, the finances that needed managing. But these were not burdens to Evelyn. They were opportunities. Opportunities to breathe new life into a space that had once felt so filled with sorrow and uncertainty, but now felt filled with hope. She wasn't just maintaining this house. She was nurturing it, just as she was nurturing herself. That afternoon, Andrew came over for a visit, and as he stepped through the front door, Evelyn noticed something different about him. He wasn't rushing in with an agenda or with the need to fix everything. He was simply there, present, ready to spend time with her. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice warm. "I was thinking we could take a look at some of Dad's old properties. I know it's been a while since we did anything with them, and I wanted to see if there's anything we can do to make them work better." Evelyn smiled, feeling a surge of pride. This was the son she had always hoped for, a son who understood the responsibility of what had been left to them, a son who was willing to roll up his sleeves and get to work. "That sounds like a good idea, Andrew," she said, her voice steady. "Let's take a look together." As they walked out into the yard, Evelyn felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't just the house, or the properties, or even the legacy that Richard had left behind. It was the sense that they were moving forward as a family, together. They were making decisions, not from a place of fear or obligation, but from a place of love and mutual respect. As they spent the afternoon working on the properties, talking about the future, and sharing stories about Richard, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. She had come so far, from a woman who had felt lost and unsure of herself, to a woman who had reclaimed her power, her independence, and her sense of purpose. She had done the hard work, the emotional labor, the introspection, and now she was ready to live fully, with intention and clarity. That evening, as Evelyn sat down to a quiet dinner, she realized that this was just the beginning. There was so much more to look forward to, more decisions to be made, more challenges to face, and more opportunities to grow. But she was no longer afraid. She had learned that she was capable of handling whatever came her way. She had learned that she was enough. And as she looked out at the garden, at the house that was slowly coming back to life, she knew that she was ready for whatever the future held. This was her time, her chance to live for herself, to honor her past, and to create a future that was uniquely her own. Reflections and lessons. Evelyn sat by the window in the living room, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The soft hues of the evening sky painted the room in shades of orange and purple, casting a peaceful glow across the space. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short period of time. Only a few months ago, this house had felt like a tomb. Quiet, heavy with grief, and filled with memories of Richard's absence. Now it was a place of possibility, of new beginnings, and of rediscovered strength. As she looked around the room, Evelyn's mind drifted to the journey she had been on since Richard's death. She had never imagined that one moment could change everything, could uproot her life and force her to rebuild from the ground up. But that was exactly what had happened. The loss of her husband had been a shock, a painful rupture in the fabric of her life, and it had sent her reeling. Yet, through the grief and confusion, Evelyn had found something she never expected: a deep well of resilience, an inner strength she had never fully recognized before. In the past, she had been so caught up in the day-to-day responsibilities of life, caring for Richard, raising Andrew, keeping the house running, that she had never stopped to think about what she wanted or needed. She had always been the one who held everything together, the one who quietly carried the weight of the family's world. But now, with Richard gone, she had been forced to face herself, to understand who she was, what she valued, and what kind of future she wanted to build. The discovery of Richard's hidden legacy had been both a blessing and a challenge. At first, the weight of managing the properties and investments had felt like a burden, a task too large to bear on her own. But as Evelyn took the time to understand the full scope of what Richard had left her, she realized that it wasn't just about money or assets. It was about the trust he had placed in her, the faith he had had in her ability to handle the future. She had been his partner, and now it was time for her to take that partnership to the next level by managing their shared legacy with care and thoughtfulness. But the financial legacy wasn't the only lesson Evelyn had learned. Over the course of her journey, she had come to understand the importance of forgiveness, both for others and for herself. She had struggled for so long with resentment, with feelings of betrayal, and with the idea that she had been left in the dark. But in the end, forgiveness had set her free. She had forgiven Richard for the secrets he had kept, understanding that he had only wanted to protect her. She had forgiven Andrew for his impulsiveness and selfishness, recognizing that he too had been navigating his own path. And most importantly, she had forgiven herself for the times she had neglected her own needs, for the moments when she had felt small and unseen. The act of forgiveness had allowed Evelyn to reclaim her own power. It wasn't about excusing anyone's behavior or forgetting the past. It was about letting go of the negative emotions that had kept her stuck in place. Forgiveness had given her the freedom to move forward with grace, to embrace the future without the weight of old grudges holding her back. Andrew, too, had been on his own journey. The young man who had once been so entitled, so quick to take control of her life, had slowly started to understand the weight of responsibility. Their relationship, which had been strained for so long, had blossomed into something new. There was still much to be done, many conversations left to have. But for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt that they were on the same page. Andrew had learned the value of hard work, of patience, and of listening, not just to others but to himself. And Evelyn had learned to trust him again, to let go of the need to control every aspect of their relationship. The shift had been gradual, but it had been profound. Their family, which had once felt fragmented and broken, was beginning to come together. They weren't perfect, but they were united in their love for each other and in their shared commitment to the future. They had learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about understanding, respect, and the willingness to fight for each other, even when things were difficult. Evelyn's mind wandered back to the house. It had been so easy to get caught up in the idea of leaving, of selling everything and starting over. The thought of moving somewhere new, somewhere that didn't carry the same weight of memories, had seemed like an attractive option. But in the end, Evelyn had realized that this house was more than just a building. It was a symbol of the life she and Richard had shared, of the dreams they had built together. It wasn't just about the physical space. It was about what that space represented, and she wasn't ready to let go of that just yet. She had made the decision to stay, not out of stubbornness, but because it felt like the right thing to do. The house had been Richard's dream, but it was also hers now. She had the power to shape it into something new, something that reflected who she was and what she wanted for the future. There was work to be done, of course. The garden needed tending, the walls needed repainting, and the business decisions needed to be made. But Evelyn wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to take on the challenge. As she sat there, looking out the window at the garden Richard had once tended so lovingly, Evelyn felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was grateful for the lessons she had learned, for the growth she had experienced, and for the strength she had found within herself. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this house so many years ago, unsure of herself and uncertain of her place in the world. She had changed, transformed, and in doing so, she had found a deeper sense of purpose. Evelyn wasn't sure what the future held. There were still challenges to face, still decisions to be made, and still healing to be done. But she was no longer afraid. She knew that whatever came her way, she was ready. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that her worth didn't come from the roles she played, from the things she did for others. It came from within, from the strength, the resilience, and the love that she carried in her heart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn smiled softly to herself. The future was waiting, and she was ready to face it, with open arms, an open heart, and the knowledge that she was enough. The journey of life is often shaped by the roles we play for others, whether as a spouse, parent, or caregiver. But true fulfillment comes when we rediscover ourselves beyond those roles. Evelyn's journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim our independence, strength, and purpose. We may have spent years supporting others, but that doesn't mean we've lost the right to focus on our own needs and desires. Forgiveness of others and ourselves allows us to release past burdens and move forward with a renewed sense of self-worth. It's not about perfection, but about growth, learning to stand on our own and recognizing our value. In our later years, it's important to embrace the opportunities we have for change, to reflect on what we've learned, and to build the life we truly want in this next chapter. As we honor our past and the lessons we've gained, we can confidently move forward, knowing that our worth is not defined by what we've done for others, but by the strength we hold within ourselves. This is the time to create the future we've always desired, full of peace, purpose, and possibility. I hope you found this story as moving as I did. Life has a way of teaching us valuable lessons, and sometimes it's the hardest moments that lead to our greatest growth. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share your thoughts below. And don't forget to check out our next video in this series, where we'll explore more stories of resilience and discovery. See you in the next one.